A massive steam locomotive violently derails, crushing the engineer to death as men in Ku Klux Klan robes emerge from the bushes. July 21st, 1873, Adair, Iowa. The dime novels called them noble highwaymen. The coroner's report proves they were an organized domestic terror cell. To understand the absolute savagery of Jesse James, you have to look at the wreckage on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. It was a warm summer evening. The train was scheduled to carry $75,000 in Yankee gold bullion from Cheyenne. Jesse James and his gang were waiting just past a blind curve. They didn't stand on the tracks with their guns drawn like in the theatrical movies. They were cowards. They used heavy iron tools stolen from a nearby section house to pry the spikes out of the western rail. They tied a thick rope to the loose steel and dug a trench in the embankment to hide. When the massive steam locomotive came roaring around the bend at 30 miles per hour, they violently yanked the rope. The heavy iron rail shifted. The train hit the gap and instantly launched off the tracks. A standard locomotive of the era weighed over 60,000 pounds. When 60,000 pounds of iron hits a broken track, it doesn't just stop. It buries itself deep into the earth. The locomotive plowed into the dirt and flipped onto its side. It crushed the train's engineer, a man named John Rafferty, instantly to death. The heavy boiler ruptured. Scalding water and highly pressurized steam exploded through the cabin, severely burning the firemen. As the trapped passengers screamed in the wreckage, the gang stepped out of the brush. Witnesses confirmed that all but one of the men were wearing full, white Ku Klux Klan hoods and robes. This was not a simple robbery. It was a heavily armed, politically motivated insurgency. The history books love to paint Jesse James as a rugged Western folk hero, a modern Robin Hood who stole from the wealthy northern banks to feed the struggling southern farmers. That is a heavily manufactured lie. Jesse James and his brother Frank were hardened, deeply bitter Confederate bushwhackers. During the Civil War, they rode with a brutal guerrilla unit called Quantrill's Raiders. They specialized in ambushing Union patrols, executing unarmed prisoners in the streets, and burning entire towns to the ground. When the Civil War ended at Appomattox, Jesse James simply refused to accept the surrender. He didn't return to farming. He viewed the expanding northern railroad monopolies as an invading army. Every express car was a target. Every bank clerk was an enemy. Using Ku Klux Klan robes during the Adair derailment proved exactly what he stood for. He was a rebel using terror tactics to ignite a war that had already ended 8 years prior. He boarded the crashed train in Iowa, stepped over the dead engineer, and forced the express guard to open the safe. The gang discovered the $75,000 in gold had been secretly moved to a later train. They had derailed a massive locomotive and murdered a working-class man for a mere $2,000 in currency. Jesse James didn't just accept the loss and walk away. He marched down the tilted aisles of the derailed passenger cars. He held a massive Colt revolver to the heads of terrified men, women, and children. He forced them to empty their pockets, stealing their pocket watches, their wedding rings, and the few crumpled dollars they had to their name. The railroad companies paid the wages of engineers like John Rafferty. They paid the salaries of express guards and firemen and brakemen. Tens of thousands of working-class families across the Midwest depended on those payrolls arriving intact. Every successful robbery didn't just hurt the monopolies. It came directly out of the pockets of the men who built the frontier with their hands. The Adams Express Company was bleeding out. The railroad monopolies realized that the local sheriffs in the Midwest were completely useless. Half of them were heavily outgunned and terrified of the James Younger gang. The other half were pro-South Democrats, former Confederates themselves, who actively hid the outlaws in their barns and cheered when the Northern trains derailed. The corporations could not rely on the local law. They needed a military strategist. They needed the man who successfully smuggled Abraham Lincoln through hostile territory in the dead of night. They pooled together funds to write a massive check to Allan Pinkerton. Let us pause for a quick station identification. The Mellow Cowboy radio is a listener-powered frequency. You can quickly support this station by hitting the like button and dropping a comment to let me know exactly what state you're listening from. If you want to go above and beyond, hit subscribe. Now, let us get back to the program. Allan looked at the photograph of the derailed locomotive, half buried in Iowa dirt. He read John Rafferty's name in the coroner's report. 24 years after crawling through the river grass on Bogus Island, the barrel maker from Scotland had built the most powerful intelligence apparatus in American history. And none of it had prepared him for this. To Allan Pinkerton, Jesse James was not a romantic frontier rebel. He was a savage, cowardly murderer, still draped in the white robes of a racist terror organization. The professional in him saw a solvable problem. The abolitionist in him saw something that needed to be destroyed. He took the contract. He deployed his operatives into Missouri with a clear directive: treat the James Younger gang exactly like a hostile military force. He opened the rogues gallery. He mapped the exact geographic network of sympathetic Confederate farmers who were supplying the outlaws with fresh horses and ammunition. He believed that if he applied enough pressure, the criminal network would collapse. He believed the local citizens of Missouri would eventually see Jesse James for the monster that he was. He was stepping back into the mud to finish the war that Jesse James refused to stop fighting. But there was a dangerous fault line running through the entire operation. Surgical and righteous are not the same thing. And Allan Pinkerton, for the first time in his career, was letting fury lead. He severely underestimated the power of the enemy. He thought he was hunting a gang of bank robbers. He didn't realize he was about to fight a massive, heavily funded media machine that would turn a domestic terrorist into a god. Jesse James understood something Pinkerton didn't. The unblinking eye had spent 20 years winning by staying invisible. Jesse James intended to win by being impossible to ignore. Pinkerton thought he was fighting a gang of outlaws. He had no idea he was fighting a printing press. His first 3 agents never made it back. Joseph Witcher was 26 years old, married, with his whole life ahead of him. Pinkerton sent him to infiltrate the James family farm in Clay County, Missouri. He was found face down in a ditch, bound, tortured, shot dead. 2 more agents, Lewis Lull and Ed Daniels, were sent after the younger brothers. Both died in a gunfight. 3 operatives, 3 bodies. The unblinking eye had never lost men like this. Pinkerton was not just furious, he was humiliated. He vowed that when they met, it would be the death of one or both of them. In January 1875, Pinkerton's men received a tip. Jesse and Frank James were visiting their mother's farm in Clay County. On the night of January 26th, a heavily armed group surrounded the farmhouse in the dark. They believed the brothers were inside. They were not. In an attempt to flush the occupants out, the raiders threw an incendiary device right through the window. It exploded. It instantly killed Jesse and Frank's 9-year-old half-brother, Archie. It blew the right arm completely off their mother. 2 innocent civilians, a child and an old woman, neither of them Jesse James. Pinkerton claimed it was an accident, but his own private letters revealed his actual intent was to burn the house to the ground. The Missouri newspapers detonated, and John Newman Edwards was waiting with a match. Edwards was not a journalist. He was a Confederate propagandist with a printing press. An ex-soldier and newspaper editor, Edwards had spent years after the Civil War searching for ways to venerate the Confederacy. He found the perfect vehicle in Jesse James. He co-founded the Kansas City Times to champion the return of former Confederates to political power. He had been building the Jesse James myth for years. Now, Pinkerton had handed him the single most powerful weapon imaginable. A dead child, a maimed mother, and a northern detective agency operating on behalf of wealthy railroad monopolies. Edwards ran the story everywhere. He did not just cover the raid, he completely reframed the war. The James boys were not terrorists. They were persecuted sons of the South. Pinkerton was not a detective. He was a hired assassin for the Yankee railroad barons, murdering innocent farm families in the dead of night. The narrative caught fire. The public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. The Missouri State Legislature narrowly defeated a bill that offered the James and younger brothers full amnesty. Let that land for a moment. The state government nearly passed a law congratulating domestic terrorists for their crimes. Former Confederates back in power actively limited the governor's reward money, shielding the gang from capture. The massive corporations quietly pulled their contracts. Allan Pinkerton was effectively removed from the hunt. He had gone into Missouri with surgical precision and righteous fury. He came out having bombed a farmhouse, killed a child, and made Jesse James immortal. Let us pause for a quick station identification. The Mellow Cowboy radio is a listener-powered frequency. You can quickly support this station by hitting the like button and dropping a comment to let me know exactly what state you're listening from. If you want to go above and beyond, hit subscribe. Now, let us get back to the program. But Jesse James understood exactly what Edwards was doing. He fed the machine deliberately. Jesse James was not just a bank robber. He was a media operation, and he ran it with the same cold precision he used to derail trains. He wrote letters directly to newspaper editors under false names, protesting his innocence, framing every robbery as an act of political resistance against corrupt Northern power. He understood that the newspapers needed a character, and he gave them one. He was even known to hand out written press releases to witnesses at the scenes of his crimes. Detailed, carefully worded accounts of the robbery handed to terrified bystanders before the gang rode off into the dark. By the time the sheriff arrived, the story was already written. And John Newman Edwards made sure the entire country read it. Edwards was a bourbon-soaked ex-Confederate officer who had spent the Civil War riding with General Shelby and had never emotionally surrendered at Appomattox. He challenged rival journalists to duels. He wrote in a style so florid and theatrical it read like a Walter Scott novel rewritten for the frontier. After the James gang robbed the Kansas City Industrial Exposition in broad daylight in front of 10,000 witnesses, Edwards ran an editorial calling the outlaws men who could have sat with Arthur at the Round Table, ridden in tourney with Sir Lancelot. He was not covering the news. He was writing scripture for a lost cause that refused to die. Edwards printed a letter from Jesse claiming the gang robbed the rich and gave to the poor. There is no historical evidence that Jesse James ever gave a single dollar to anyone outside his own gang. But the story was already loose in the world, and a story, once it takes root in the right soil, does not require the truth to survive. Pinkerton spent the rest of his life desperately trying to reclaim his reputation. He authored more than 17 books, spinning his agency's real-life adventures into legend through the very dime novels that had glorified his enemies. He was fighting myth with myth. He never caught Jesse James. One of Jesse's own gang members, a man looking for a bounty, shot Jesse in the back of the head in 1882. The barrel maker from Scotland, the abolitionist, the man who built America's first intelligence apparatus and smuggled a president through hostile territory in the dead of night, lost a public relations war to a Confederate journalist and a killer who handed out press releases. In 1884, Allan Pinkerton died. He tripped on a sidewalk, bit his tongue, and perished from gangrene. The unblinking eye finally closed. But the agency marched on, and without the man who built it on a foundation of radical working-class idealism, it became something he would not have recognized, something he might have spent his youth in Glasgow fighting against. If you want to uncover the brutal truth of what the Pinkerton Agency became, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below and let me know. We are just getting started.